Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hudson Institute. Our purpose is to promote American leadership and engagement for a secure, free, and democratic world. I'm Charles Davidson, the Executive Director of the Kleptocracy Initiative here at Hudson Institute, and I'm going to be the introducer and moderator for today's session, which is all about David Satter and his most recent book, which is an absolute must-read. None of us can afford not to read it. And just to set the scene, I'm going to read just a few sentences from David's book that underscore his thesis. The sheer difficulty of accepting the idea that any regime would murder hundreds of its own citizens to terrify the nation and hold on to power. This refusal to believe the unbelievable, however, came at a cost. It crippled Western, and in particular, U.S. policy toward Russia, rendering it naive and ineffectual. From the moment Putin took power, the West was dealing with Russia on the basis of a picture of the country that had no relation to reality. David will introduce himself and speak for about 25 minutes. Then our panelists will respond and discuss the book a bit, followed by questions and answers. Thank you for coming. David?
Is my mic working? Yeah. Now it's working. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, once again, thank you for coming, and your presence here is much appreciated by me because I take it as recognition of the importance of the question that's raised in the book that I've just completed. The inspiration for the book was my expulsion from Russia in December 2013. It was not just a question of, in some way or the other, getting back at the Russian authorities. I had no desire to do that. But I realized that the act of the Russian authorities in expelling me in December 2013, after tolerating my presence in Russia for so many years and pretending that I didn't bother them, was in fact a critical turning point, and so it turned out to be. The Maidan revolt had begun 3 weeks earlier, and on the basis of evidence that we now have and signs that were obvious at the time, the self-organizing anti-criminal revolution in Ukraine simply created a new situation politically in Russia itself. What had been tolerated could no longer be tolerated. What had been allowed in the interests of creating a false facade that could mislead the outside world was now a luxury that the Russian authorities could not afford. When I was expelled, I was told, and a statement was read by a Russian diplomat, that the competent organs, and that's a code for the FSB, the successor organization to the KGB, have determined that your presence on the territory of the Russian Federation is undesirable and you're banned from entering the country. Of course, hearing those words, I was impressed by the amount of territory where I was suddenly considered undesirable. But there was no real reason given, but I knew the reason, and I didn't need a reason. And the reason was because I tried, during all the years that I've been writing about Russia, to convey the true story of the country, including the true story of the country under Yeltsin, something that is not well understood in the West. And most important, the true story of the critical event in post-communist history, which was the bombing of the apartment buildings in Moscow, Buynaksk, and Volgodonsk in 1999. Those bombings were the hinge on which post-communist Russian history turns. They were the culmination of the criminalization of Russia under Yeltsin. They were the foundation of the dictatorship that was established under Putin. They are the identifying marks of a leadership that has absolutely no respect for human life, the lives of its own citizens, or the lives of others. They were also a symbol of how poorly we in the West, in trying to deal with Russia, understand the phenomenon with which we're obliged to deal. Constant, effusive gestures of goodwill on our part have always been culminated by have always been met with acts of aggression on the Russian side. Just recently, a scholar, and I put the word scholar in inverted commas, at one of our brother think tanks was explaining that the problem in U.S.-Russian relations was that Obama hates Putin, Putin doesn't like Obama, and this intense personal difference is poisoning relations, as if this was a popularity contest and there were no serious reasons for differences between the two sides. But in fact, there are serious differences. A country which is ruled by a regime which came to power as the result of an act of terror carried out against its own people cannot be an appropriate friend or ally for the United States. It can only become that when the underlying values that motivate the behavior of that country change. Now, I have been trying ever since 1999 to call the attention of the world to the true facts of how power changed hands in Russia and the true story of post-Soviet Russia. I published a book in 2003 in which I made charges that are similar to the ones that are contained in my most recent book. Even those people who praised the book were unwilling to engage with the argument that what happened in Russia was the result of a terrorist act carried out by Russia's own government. And the situation did not change as the other people who were making similar accusations to the ones that I was making were murdered one by one. First, Sergei Yushchenkov was shot outside of his apartment building. Yuri Shekhatyikhin poisoned after returning from a trip to Ryazan. Anna Politkovskaya murdered as she got out of an elevator in her apartment building. Alexander Litvinenko poisoned with a nuclear isotope in London. Through a process of elimination, I was left as practically the only person in the world who was making this accusation publicly. And I did so in testimony before the House Foreign Relations Committee in 2007. Against the background of verifiable facts which I raised and which were raised by the other people who were in fact killed for their efforts, in the face of the obvious complicity of the authorities in the murders of Alexander Litvinenko and Anna Politkovskaya, a courageous and crusading investigative reporter in Russia, the response of the United States was to institute the reset policy, the purpose of which was to show that the problems in U.S.-Russian relations were the fault of President Bush. Well, what are the indications? Why is it that I am so convinced that this was an act of terror carried out by the Russian government against its own people? In fact, it's not a conspiracy theory. It is not a wild supposition that's unworthy of attention, but rather something that a conclusion that's based on abundant evidence. In the United States, circumstantial evidence will convict. Many people are in prison today on the basis of circumstantial evidence. This is more than circumstantial evidence, although I'd like to point out that much of it is circumstantial evidence, which, unlike eyewitness evidence, is impossible to fake. First of all, the FSB agents were caught putting a bomb in the basement of a building in Ryazan in the middle of September. Ryazan is a city southeast of Moscow, after 4 buildings had already been blown up. The reason that a 5th building wasn't blown up was because vigilant neighbors witnessed suspicious persons going down into the basement. They called the police, forced them to go down there, and they found a bomb. A test of the bomb with a gas analyzer showed the presence of hexagon. That's the high explosive that was used to blow up the other 4 buildings. The FSB arrived at the scene and removed the bomb, but they forgot the detonator. The detonator was photographed and time-stamped. It's a highly professional military detonator. The residents of the building were evacuated and spent the night on the street. And not only were the residents of the building evacuated, but the entire district was evacuated. The entire city was cut off, and no cars could enter or leave Ryazan. And as a result of that, and as a result of a sketch based on descriptions of the persons who were carrying something down into the basement, the 3 persons who had planted the bomb were caught. And the KGB, the FSB, the head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, made an announcement on the following day in which he said, well, actually, the bomb was a dummy. It consisted not of high explosives, but of sugar. The detonator was a fake. And all of this was done in order to test the residents of Ryazan for their vigilance. He then congratulated the residents of Ryazan for passing the test so brilliantly. Of course, I then went to Ryazan to actually talk to people to investigate what happened, and all of the police insisted that that this was no test, and everything about it was extremely realistic. And in fact, the local FSB officers and the local police officers were also convinced that this was a real bomb. And they told the crowds of people on the street that you can consider that today is your 2nd birthday. Or they said, there's a Russian expression, you can consider that you were born in a shirt, which is an expression for someone who is really very, very lucky. After the building on Guryanova Street was blown up in Moscow, police arrived at the office of the superintendent of the building, a man named Blumenfeld, and they asked for a sketch of the person who rented the basement in which the explosives were placed. He gave a sketch, and it was circulated. And then the next day, it was withdrawn from circulation, and a second sketch was offered of someone who looked completely different. Blumenfeld later explained that he was pressured to say that the second sketch was the sketch of the person he had seen. But an investigator named Mikhail Trepashkin was able to find the only copy of the first sketch, which was still in existence because one newspaper in Moscow had succeeded in printing the original sketch. And to his astonishment, it was a picture of crime. Short time later, that agent was killed when he was hit by a car in Cyprus. Why would the FSB be so anxious to remove the original sketch? And finally, Gennady Seleznyov, of the State Duma got up after the bombing, the second Moscow bombing, which took place on Kashirskaya Highway, and announced that I have information that a building has been blown up in Volgodonsk. Problem was that no building had been blown up in Volgodonsk. That was on September 13th. On September 16th, the building was blown up in Volgodonsk. And even a crackpot like Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the leader of the so-called and misnamed Liberal Democratic Party, was astonished and says, "How is it that you announced that an apartment was blown up on the 13th and it's blown up on the 16th?" And that his microphone was cut off and he was prevented from speaking. Then he offered the explanation that, well, actually there was an explosion in Volgodonsk that on the 15th, that in which there were no casualties, but a building there was an explosion in a building, and the suspects were as a result of a gang rivalry of some sort. Well, that raises a number of questions. Why it was important to announce in front of the entire national parliament that there had been a minor explosion in a provincial city in which no one was injured. But the most important thing that no one could answer is how did, if indeed that was what he was talking about, how did he know about it 2 days in advance? And there is a massive, the point is there's a massive of information. It's not that the truth about how Putin came to power is not known or cannot be known. It can be known, and it can be known easily. What's at stake is the refusal to face the truth and to understand and to make the intellectual effort to understand that an entirely different approach to Russia is necessary than the one that we have adopted. Certainly, true knowledge of what happened in 1999 would preclude not only a reset policy, but the whole interpretation that was behind it. Similarly, it would preclude, I would hope, some of the stupid remarks being made by the present presidential candidates. Why did it happen? I can't go into all of the evidence regarding the apartment bombings, but when you ask your questions, I can, if you have them, I can try to respond to at least to a certain extent. Well, contrary to what was thought in this country, the Yeltsin period was not marked by the democratic flourishing of Russia, the development of democratic institutions, and the creation of a new Western-oriented state capable of being a security partner of the United States. The Yeltsin period was marked by the criminalization of the entire country. It was a period during literally the gangster was king and all normal values were overturned. Insofar as it wasn't appreciated in the West, it was because so much of American policy at that time was career-driven. And there was not a willingness to accept, assimilate, and evaluate some of the very good reporting that was coming from lower level and lower ranking diplomats, many of whom, in fact, had an accurate view of what was taking place in the country. This is a problem that we face in foreign policy toward Russia and have faced traditionally. The goal was to transform the economy and to place property in private hands and to do it as quickly as possible, to make it impossible for there to be a communist revanche, regardless, by the way, of the will of the people. As it happened, in fact, the population, as a referendum in 1993 showed, were fully in favor of of liberal economic changes and the introduction of a free market. What they were not in favor of was the massive theft that took place in the name of privatization and the complete destruction of the infrastructure of the country and impoverishment of the people, while a small group of well-connected criminals became the new leaders of society. And that had reached the point, the conditions under Yeltsin had reached the point in which ordinary Russians were driven to desperation. It's not well understood, but the number of surplus deaths during the Yeltsin period was 6 million. Some Russians refer to this as Golodomor, which is the phrase for the Ukrainian famine, Holodomor. The reason was that the death rate under the conditions that were established in Russia in the 1990s reached levels that are simply not seen in peacetime. Only a country at war has that kind of death rate. And the despair of the people was such, and the anger was such, that Yeltsin had no chance of being reelected, of having an ally or a putative successor being elected without the help of a provocation. And in 1999, the summer of 1999, Moscow was awash in rumors that some type of grandiose provocation was in the works, and it was going to make it possible to establish martial law. And after the bombings took place, one well-informed, after the first bombings took place, and I, like everyone else, was not sure exactly what's going on here. Could it have been a gas leak or what it is? But when the one building after another began to be blown up in the middle of the night, and all of this was blamed on Chechens, I realized that there was something suspicious. The Chechens denied they had anything to do with it, but the country was mobilized for a new Chechen war. In fact, the population up until that time had no desire for a new military engagement in Chechnya. A friend of mine who connected me to sources of information in the security services themselves, because even in the FSB there were people who were not happy about seeing their own people being blown up under suspicious circumstances. He told me, he said, the Yeltsin family is terrified for their survival. They're ready to blow up half of Moscow if their security isn't guaranteed. And I asked him to put me in touch with the persons who were giving him the information, because including a lot of information I just don't have time to share with you, but I can later. And it's certainly in the book. And I met with them, obviously under conspiratorial conditions. And they explained to me, the whole thing doesn't make sense. There's only one factory that produces hexagon. It's guarded day and night by the FSB. Nobody can transport that much hexagon to so many different locations and coordinate that many explosions without official participation. Well, where does all this leave us? We have a presidential race now. One candidate is simply a caricature in terms of his naivete and the ridiculous statements he makes. But the other candidate had access to full intelligence information if she was interested in it, and had the precedence of one murder after another, and nonetheless was an avid advocate of the reset policy, which has proven to be completely unrealistic. So what is it that's wrong with us, and what is it that we need to do in order to, first of all, restrain Russia's behavior, both toward us, because they've now, the latest stage in this drama is that Putin, who emerged from this act of terrorism, is now threatening the world with nuclear weapons. And people can say he's just kidding, but it's a bad joke. And I think that, and there's also the question of the Russian people themselves. The most creative, the most industrious people are being driven, the most liberal-minded are being driven out of the country. Those people who remain are being zombified by numbing state propaganda, for which we have no very effective response. And are naive and clueless in dealing with Russia. So where do we begin? And I think that, and all too often we get lost in the minutiae of daily policy issues, which, although highly important in and of themselves, are going to be effectively resolved without a knowledge and an understanding of the context. And the context is the true history of the country. What happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, why it happened, and what kind of country are we dealing with. The nature, and this stems ultimately from a failure to understand the real nature of communism. Communism is habitually understood as an economic phenomenon. The government takes over ownership of the means of production and destroys the economy, and in the process kills a lot of people, maybe. Although in the later stages, the communist regime in the Soviet Union was not killing people, although there was mass repression. But the reality is that communism is not an economic phenomenon, it's a moral phenomenon. We don't understand the moral base of communism, which is an explicit rejection of the entire edifice of moral values upon which Western life is based. Then you're very tempted to think that all you have to do is change economic structures, when in fact the underlying moral problem continues to exist. And that's what happened in Russia. The economic structures were changed, but they were changed in the absence of the rule of law. And as a result, you got gangsterism. And insofar as gangsterism, under conditions of pseudo-democracy, cannot sustain itself without provocations, the KGB became the inheritors of power. And insofar as the KGB is inhabited by people who are living in a delusionary world, for one thing, and are dedicated to power and nothing else, the result is the extinguishing of even those aspects of democratic rule that existed under the previous regime, under the regime which favored the oligarchs, kleptocrats, and the gangsters. So, to wrap up, the message of the book, and the message that I've tried to convey in my writing over the years, and will try and continue, and I will try to do this in the future, is that the first priority is to understand the context in which policy decisions are made and policy issues are debated. And this is important not just for us, it's important for Russians as well, because they really are crippled by their historical experience and by the dictatorial regime that exists there, and the massive mindless propaganda. Once you have the context right, the hundreds of policy issues with which we are confronted in our dealings with Russia and with the former Soviet Union will have will be clarified, and we'll be able to act with greater wisdom, not only in our own interests, but in the interests of the Russian people as well. Well, I want to stick to the time frame that I have, but I will be glad afterwards to answer any questions. And of course, there is more to say about Thank you very much. All right. All right. Starts here?
Sit in the middle.
All right, okay.
All right, gentlemen, well, it's a great pleasure to introduce this panel because most of them are old friends, and then one of them's a new friend, Bob Armstrong here. I think I'll introduce Amsterdam.
Bob
I
Amsterdam.
always get that wrong. I'll get it eventually. Anyway,
Just
Robert,
think of Holland.
I know. I'll get it eventually. But anyway, Bob is an international lawyer who has had an absolutely unique and fascinating career, taking on very, very interesting, high-profile cases. And I urge you all to look up Robert Amsterdam and to read a little bit about his work and career. I guarantee you, you will not be bored. To Bob's right is our president of the National Endowment for Democracy, Carl Gershman, who I guess has been president of it since soon after his birth. It's been a long time. He was the founding president, if I got it correctly. Is that right, Carl?
Yes.
Yes. And then David Satter doesn't require further introduction. And Kevin Klose, to my left, was with the Washington Post for many years. And he was the Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post. He was president of Free Europe, Radio Liberty twice. He was president of NPR also, and he is currently a professor of journalism at the Maryland School of Journalism. So, Bob, Carl, and Kevin are going to say a few words each for a few minutes, and then we will have maybe a little bit of a discussion amongst ourselves, and we will open it up to you as soon as we can. So, David, who shall we start with amongst ourselves?
Oh, that's such a weighty decision. Why don't we start with Bob Amsterdam, because he's on the left there.
Well, thank you all. And David, thank you for another heroic book. I think the book is a phenomenon in that it, in a very few pages, sets out the fundamental nature of the regime that we are dealing with. And there are two aspects I'm going to address. One is the recklessness of Vladimir Putin. I think from the first moment the Kursk sank till now, one of the things about the regime that always floors me is the recklessness with which it endangers the lives of citizens. And I think the book demonstrates that in respect to not only the apartment bombings, but Nordost, Beslan, and some of these other horrific events that have punctuated recent Russian history. And it's well beyond an issue just of the rule of law. It's really an issue that we need to come forward with, which is that those in charge of Russia today have really, in a way, declared war on their own citizens. It's a very unique, it's a very cynical level that the present Russian kleptocracy has reached. And it's very dangerous for all of us. I was reading an article this morning in Foreign Affairs where I think Mr. Treisman was talking about the occupation of Crimea, not as some well-thought-out policy, but as another moment of kind of reckless opportunism. And at a moment when America is historically at its lowest point in terms of Russia, when we have a president who is completely discounted by the leaders of Russia and China, we're at a very dangerous moment history. And there's one other thing to look at in terms of Russia, which I look at as a lawyer, which is that the use of law in Russia as a mobilization technique needs to really be understood, because in our own war on terror in the West, we are in a different level, but we're starting to come at the same approach in a way to this need, this constant need for a state of emergency, a state of exception. And that state of exception we must always walk away from, because no true democracy can function when its citizenry is constantly being directed against another threat, when its citizenry are constantly being taught to be victims, whether it is because a color is going to change here in Washington on the degree of threat we face, or whether it's in Russia and you're being told that NATO is going to invade. This constant move by our leaders in both countries to move us towards emergency is dangerous. And this book is so incredibly powerful and important because it is not just an object lesson of what's going on in Russia. It's a guide to the dangers that follow us down the rabbit hole of the war on terror and the idea of exceptionalism, and a presidential candidate who starts talking about banning people because of their religious beliefs. We are allowing ourselves in America today to be intoxicated and zombified ourselves. So watching our friends and our brothers and sisters in Russia and what's happened to them is an important lesson that goes well beyond their borders. And David, again, thank you for a really worthwhile and heroic book.
I want to share those congratulations, and then also, say that what impresses me, David, about what you're doing is your focus on this particular phenomenon, this event that took place, or the series of events that took place in 1999. And you're not going to let that go. And I think that's very good. It has actually never been refuted. I mean, what David is writing has never been refuted. Try it out. And they, say what happens, and then they say that they mentioned 3 people who, I Googled them, they're totally obscure people. They criticize it. They don't say what the criticism was. They don't say what the other explanations were for what happened. It's just never been refuted. And I think David makes the case that what happened was real. And then you have to then follow that up. What are the implications of thinking about this regime that still exists in Russia today after 17 years, the regime of Vladimir Putin, who has, as the Economist once said, rode a tank over the international order when he invaded and annexed Crimea, and now is invading and still carrying on the war in eastern Ukraine, and then you have Syria and so forth. And these are very, very significant things, and yet we're dealing with him as if he's sort of a normal leader. And so this is something that has very, very deep implications, and I hope that what David is doing will lead to further investigative articles about this, PhD theses. I could see congressional hearings. I talked to one congressman recently who was telling me he had met with some Duma people from Russia, and he thought they had a chip on their shoulder. And I asked him, well, do you know anything about the apartment bombings? And he said he didn't. This was a really knowledgeable congressman about this. And in any event, he's gotten interested in it. And I think more people should be interested in it because it's not something that is ancient history, because we're still dealing with the consequences of that today. And as David was talking before, he sort of reminded me of Bill Browder, who, got totally focused after the murder of Magnitsky in prison, who was working for him. And the end result was the Magnitsky Bill. And now we have a global Magnitsky Act, which just passed the House Foreign Affairs Committee this week. And I hope it will, become law. And this terrifies a lot of the people who have committed these acts. And I think we should be thinking hard about a moral equivalent of the Magnitsky Act. You don't want to get into policy too much, but if all of what you're saying is true, we should think of some way to respond to this in a meaningful way that would advance justice in Russia, because in a way you're fighting for these 293 people in the same way, for justice in the same way that Browder is fighting for justice for Magnitsky. Now, the book does much more than just talk about the apartment bombings. That's the first chapter. But you know, the chapters after that are also pretty hair-raising and frightening. And David, you know, you don't have as much evidence on Nordost and Beslan as you have on the apartment bombings, but David believes, and he gives strong circumstantial evidence that these horrendous things that happened, the attack on, you know, the so-called terrorist attacks on the theater, and then the Beslan school, and then the attack on the terrorists by the Chechens, by Russian forces, where they, you know, they wouldn't negotiate. They had no regard for the lives of the hostages. I mean, what he tells in the book is an absolute horror on both counts. These things have not been investigated, and Putin was able to use these things, again, like the apartment bombings, to alarm the Russian people and build his power. And so that is another important aspect of this book. And then I think, you know, in a way, the most revelatory chapter for me was the chapter about Yeltsin. Because Yeltsin, you know, still retains a good reputation in this country. He's the guy that oversaw the collapse of the the Soviet Empire, and was feted in this town for a very, very long time, and seen as a good Democrat. But the story that David tells about the destruction of the attack upon and the destruction of the parliament, and then the adoption of a constitution soon after in 1993 that gave all the power to the presidency, tells a totally different story about Yeltsin, who really set the stage for Putin. And then I think, as David is saying, that the apartment bombings and Putin's coming to power in 1999 had a lot to do with Yeltsin, who, you know, wanted to get immunity from prosecution for everything that happened before. The first act, as David points out in the book, of Putin when he became the acting president was indeed to give Yeltsin and his family immunity from prosecution. So it really tells a sordid story, and a broader story than that. And then, you know, I think maybe one last point about, you know, what David has done in the book. I think, you know, what is, and you alluded to this in your comments before about communism not being an economic system, but, you know, a moral phenomenon. And we don't really understand that, and we don't understand the consequences of that. And David has sort of focused more than anyone on the failure of the Russian government and people after the fall of communism to deal with the past, as Sakharov, you know, called for. They never did that, quite the contrary, and then they've built now what is an utterly criminal state, and they remain morally degraded, and the state remains morally degraded, as he's pointing out. And that is something, you know, that obviously still has profound consequences today, and the most horrendous things happen, you know, where people like Anna Politkovskaya and Natasha Estimirova and Boris Nemtsov, these are some of the greatest people in the world, are murdered because they try to stand up against this. Two final points. We should not forget that there are people in Russia. You said, David, that they forced out a lot of the liberals and the creative people, and the people left are zombified. There are people left in Russia who are fighting, who are risking their lives, and there are a lot of them. And they are, you know, they hope that a change will come. And Putin is nervous. You know, they have elections on September the 18th. They've just passed a whole slew of laws prohibiting monitors. Putin has just created a 400,000 personnel Praetorian Guard around himself, which is run by his personal bodyguard, Viktor Zolotov. And he's nervous. He's terrified. I heard the U.S. ambassador speaking at a meeting recently where he said that Putin obsessively watches videos of Gaddafi's fall and murder. That he's terrified of this. This is not a secure leader, even though, you know, and he's not behaving as if he has 89% support. And we have to remember that there are people in Russia that believe that Russia can have a better alternative. It will be extremely difficult given all the moral degradation, the criminality that you've talked about. But there are people there who are conducting that fight, and they need help, and they need recognition, and they need support. Maybe a last point is just that one of these people is somebody by the name of Ilya Yashin, who was the closest associate of Boris Nemtsov. And recently, he was here in Washington to release this report called The Threat to National Security. And it's about Ramzan Kadyrov, who is now the Chechen leader who is allied with Putin. He's got 30,000 armed people under his control, at least 30,000. And even people in the FSB are worried about this guy. In other words, I think the regime is even splitting over this, and Putin has really just asked him to stay in power. And the basic point of this is that Kadyrov is the threat to Russian national security today. Putin has created a monster. And that monster, which is Kadyrov and everything he represents, is a direct product of the apartment bombings in 1999 of this regime. And it's even terrifying now the Russian elite. They've created a monster and they're terrified of this themselves. And it obviously is not just limited to Russia. This is something that affects all of us. Thank you.
David and I have a long history of journalism, both in the United States. We met first at the Washington Post newsroom in the late 1960s. And about a decade later, we bumped into each other by complete accident on Gorky Street in Moscow, where he was reporting for the Financial Times and I was there for the Washington Post, after Bradley exiled me from the newsroom, just on L Street. And I just want to talk about the nature of his reporting and his contacts. There was a large U.S. press corps in Moscow in the 1970s and 80s, and actually until quite recently, until the economic turmoil and storm that has overcome a lot of the major news organizations in the country. Even papers in small cities like Baltimore had their own Moscow correspondent for their own readerships. All this kind of diversity has pretty much been removed. It's been replaced by social media practitioners of every kind, but that's another story. I want to talk about David's way of reporting. First of all, he has extraordinary Russian, and he also had dedicated himself, as I know him, to getting below the surface, to learning what the reality is below the apparently calm exterior or the repressed exterior of a cauldron of people who've been held without freedom to exercise their own views about their politics, their points of view, often their morality, and their contact with the world outside. It's a long sequential history that is only very recently, and especially after Perestroika and after the demise of the Soviet Union, people actually started to have freedom to travel and also freedom to get information which had previously been censored from their capacity to have access to. David's contacts in those years were extraordinary. Together, we traveled to the then closed city, close to foreigners, of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. We spent time with the free trade union activists in the Soviet Union who were seeking simply a fair deal for the working classes in the workers' paradise. We knew, just by comparing what had happened to these leaders, who had been one by one identified, followed, watched, then arrested, and then incarcerated in special hospitals, psychiatric hospitals for the criminally insane, many of them treated with awful drugs to distort both their psyches and also torture their bodies before they were released after these kinds of tortures. David and I spent time with these people. He knew contacts that almost nobody else in the Western journalism community knew. And he has assiduously kept his contacts open and his authenticity to people who care about freedom of thinking and actual freedom of speech and of information. They know him. He's part of an extraordinary network of people who have always been in place, but who, when they returned to Russia and to the territory of the former Soviet Union, have found these contacts waiting for them so they can convey reality back out to us in the West for the purposes of knowing, in the hope that if great governments, caring governments in the Western democracies care about what's happening in Russia, about the denial of due process, about the true denial of freedom of speech, and so forth, that they will have a resolve to help to change that situation in Russia in the context of policy, in the context of contacts, and so forth. It took the invasion the seizure of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine to get to a place where true sanctions were starting to come into place. It's one thing which we know that the Putin government absolutely hates, despises, and fears because it's having an effect on their ability to do what they have done so covertly, to do it openly with open exchange of favorable trade agreements and so forth and so on, access to Western financial markets, et cetera. Very important for them in the particularly very parlous situation they're in now with the Russian economy because of the drop in oil prices. They will come back in time, but the sequence of ups and downs don't augur well for a regime which is almost Shakespearean in the way it has come to power, and in the paranoia that surrounds it. You can see the paranoia expressed in such things as, it predates, of course, Putin. It's a long history in the Russian leaderships and in the Soviet leaderships. Paranoia about the West, paranoia about the capitalist realities, paranoia about liberalism and freedom of speech and freedom of expression. That goes way, way back. But underneath that have been sinister, completely sinister distortions of the truth and suppressions of the truth. You can think about the White Sea Canal. Those of us who know any parts of the history of the Soviet period know that it connects directly to what is happening today in Russia in a different fashion. You can look at it more recently in the Chernobyl meltdown, the worst nuclear catastrophe, civilian nuclear catastrophe in the history of atomic power. It took them days before they actually said what it was. I actually have one of my children actually coming out of Moscow was on a plane that we think flew through the outcasts of the contaminated materials in the air from Chernobyl, which at that point there were no warnings to anybody about what was in that cloud of debris that was rising into the atmosphere. That's just one example of it. When the Kursk submarine went down, and David talks about it in his extraordinary book, there were days went by when there were people still alive in the sunken submarine, desperately hoping they would be rescued, and the delays that occurred because of paranoia, but also pride and fury at what had happened, and after having to go through the whole sequence of a sham. Well, we think maybe the Americans did it because they were close at hand. Maybe it was something from the United Kingdom, which has had submarines in our backyard for years, and they share things, and it's a NATO, so forth and so on. We've seen the same reappearance of these kinds of fakeries about such things as the downing of the airliner over Ukraine. Who did that? There have been 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different, maybe 10 different versions of who they think actually brought down the airliner. Nothing to do with the Buke that probably was taken there. If you go on Bellingcat, .uk, you can see that they tracked the entire movement of that mobile anti-aircraft battery, probably from I think they traced it from Kursk, where the great tank battle was in World War II, all the way down into southeastern Ukraine. Does any of that have to do with how they think about their relationships with everybody else? That is to say, all the great governments around them with whom they wish to have normal relations? And the answer is no. It's like this. We can do as we do, and we'll keep doing it because you're not paying attention. The power of David's book in the extraordinary reporting he has done is to give us, as best anyone could do, a kind of reappearance of this kind of reality, as though it had been taken not by accident, but people who were actually there. He has taken the sequence of discoveries, of knowledge, and of facts, and brought them together in a new way, in a coherent, sequential presentation that takes us all the way back to the apartment bombings in Moscow in 1999 and traces the moral road and the immoral road that takes us out to where we are today. So it's a toxin in the darkness, in the confusion that we have in our own country about what to do about this kind of a regime. I think it's enormously powerful. It's a wonderfully readable book, and it moves with drama and reality and incessant sticking to the facts, sticking to the known suppositions. We can't know everything that happened in so remote a time and in so remote and closed a place, in a place that is repressed and that people they know that they're under possible interdiction if they speak the truth of what they know. Part of David's life has been to find those people and to bring them forward with his, as you see, a kind of geniality, an openness, and a kind of commitment to human contact in a level not only of reality of hard facts, but also in a reality of just we're in this together. His approachability and his ability to get people to open up to him and to tell them things they don't tell others seems to me to be extraordinary. It's a great talent he has. It's part of his history. It's part of his professionalism, and it's part of the reason why I think it's a pleasure and an honor to be in this platform, in this roundtable with you all and with him. And I can urge you, having read the book, I said to a group the other day, it's a hell of a read. And I wish there were copies here to buy, but I want you to go out. It's a wonderful book. It's a quick read. You can take it to the beach with you. But the point is to remember what it's about. It takes us on the moral journey back to a very, very dark place. And what he's telling us is there's no moral difference today than there was when those attacks on the population, a small, defenseless, unknowing, innocent group of people, when they went forward with deliberation, with cruelty, with prejudgment, and knowing that a cover-up would occur, they thought. David Satter, thank you very much.
Well, before we open up our conversation with you all, I would like to underscore this issue of David's courage, because as you will discover if you read the book, the other people who early on tried to expose the reality of these apartment bombings are all dead, or virtually all dead. And David just kept on and fearlessly plowed on with us. He never gave up. He never changed his tune. He was expelled from Russia, as we know, and he's still here with us, and he's still relaxed and genial, which is the most amazing thing. And maybe he'll explain that to us at some point. Any other comments, David, from you before we open it up to our audience here?
No, I think it would be great if people would just ask whatever questions they have.
Okay, great. And we should have two microphones somewhere. Let's see, where do we have microphones?
Yeah.
Okay, well, all right, why don't we start all the way in back, the back row there.
Thank you very much.
Please identify
Yes,
yourself
I'm
and
Carmine DeFilio.
name and affiliation, please, as usual.
And the U.S. Department of Energy. It's very interesting. Thank you so much for the book and for all the comments. With regard to the implications of this for our past and going future foreign policy, with regard to NATO and the past expansion of NATO eastwards, without necessarily the military or political investment to make the defense of those countries as credible as the core NATO countries, do you think that was a wise movement in respect to what's happened subsequently?
Shall I? I think that look at what happened to Ukraine, which was outside of NATO. It's clear that the countries, particularly the Baltic countries, would have been subjected to excruciating pressure. They're under pressure under any circumstances. But the expansion of the NATO alliance eastward stabilized an entire swath of territory which could have been subject to Russian subversion and destabilization. The idea that Russia was provoked by that eastward expansion is a fairy tale. That's something that the Russians would like people to believe. But in reality, all it did was create limits on Russian behavior, which unfortunately didn't apply in the cases of those countries like Ukraine and Georgia, which were left out.
I'd like to add, if I could, when we moved Radio Free Europe from Munich, where it had been for many, many years, from the late 1940s right up into the 1990s, I received a letter from the then German foreign minister of Germany. At that point, it was in the process of reunifying, and the capital had moved from Bonn to Berlin and so forth. We're talking about the mid-1990s. And he wrote me a letter that said, they're very, very unhappy that this great organization was moving from Munich, but that it was in the national security interests of the Federal Republic of Germany for there to be nations to the east abiding under the rule of law in what they did and how they acted, and that was in their national interest, and therefore he was applauding the fact that the radios were moving east. That's just that version. I want to say a couple of things about the relationship. The issue of the periphery around the former Soviet Union is enormously important to those countries which are in the bloc, in what I consider to be the transition zone from the Baltics down to the Balkans, where they are struggling to secure their democratic forms of government. These are new things for people. We're very lucky in this country. We've had this for a long time. We've had many variations, and we may have some very unexpected variations in how we govern ourselves coming forward. I don't know that, but I do know that we have a long history. We have a particular defense of civil liberties of the individual. That's part of who we're at. We can see it happening every day in this country where we're challenging the repressions as we learn about them. And legislation occurs, reforms occur, behaviors change. It's never consistently that thing. It's always under stress, and we know all that. In the East, this kind of struggle to identify and preserve civil liberties, once they have been guaranteed under the new rules of these new democracies, self-inventing themselves for a second and third time sometimes, are very important to them. If I said to a group here a year ago, does anyone in this room think that if Ukraine had been in NATO, that they would have marched into Crimea and there would be now a struggle over it? No, wouldn't have happened. So the answer is yes. They could have, they should have, they would have. It didn't happen. In 2013, in the summer, I just finish it off. In the summer of 2013, there was a big meeting up in Vilnius. You know the group that came together. And in that, just before that meeting occurred and just after it, senior emissaries from Moscow were sent to Azerbaijan, to Armenia, to Georgia, to turn around and tell them, you're not going further west in this EU entry sequence you're in. That's what they told them. And every one of them stopped, and that's part of what happened that led to the upheaval in Ukraine. So the answer is, can a regime like the Putin regime, with its inheritance from a dark past and its reality in a dark present, can it allow to have a large Slavic brotherhood country with free elections, with an independent court system, with a transparent financial system that's part of such as it is, the best it can be so far, and maybe it'll get better after a lot of the investigations about dark money and the rest of it. Maybe we can clean up a lot of this stuff. But can they afford to have that kind of consistency right on their border and see it take off intellectually, creatively, because that is the lifeblood of the future, to have freedom of speech, creativity, movement, and so forth. And sitting there where they're sitting, in the repression they live in the theft and the violence they live in, state-sanctioned, can they have that on their border? That's what Ukraine is all about.
Anybody else want to comment on NATO, this issue? Yeah.
I think the issue for me isn't just NATO. It's been our hesitancy in how we dealt with Georgia and Ukraine, and what George W. Bush did in 2008 with Georgia. One of the things about Mr. Putin, this recklessness I spoke about, was also the predictive nature. A predator constantly is stalking his prey. And when the United States, under George Bush, let Putin engage in Georgia the way he did, it was a clear signal. And this clear signal that the West was rolling back has been the background music over the last number of years. And that's what resulted in Crimea, and that's what's resulted in what we're dealing with, not only in Ukraine, but now in Syria. And you have to be extraordinarily careful about accepting the Russian narrative of either expansion or victimization, because the key to, in my view, understanding Russia is understanding that all of these foreign policy initiatives become more and more reckless because the velocity increases in direct proportion to the insecurity of the leadership. We're in a terribly dangerous moment because Vladimir Putin's looking at Gaddafi's picture. And the fact that he believes Mr. Obama is incapable of restraining him, and that has no stomach to do any of that, it puts us at a very dangerous time.
Well, I just want to maybe follow up on something that Kevin was saying, which is really very, very important about Ukraine. It's very central. I mean, Ukraine wanted not to become part of NATO. It wanted to become part of the European Union. And the whole issue before the Euromaidan uprising was whether or not Ukraine would sign the association agreement with the European Union. Yanukovych originally said he would, which surprised a lot of people. And then Putin did intervene. By the way, Georgia never backed off. Georgia wants to be part of Europe, and I hope it will eventually become. But Putin intervened, Yanukovych backed off. That led to the first protests, and before you knew it, you had this massive uprising in Ukraine, the Euromaidan. And this was a freedom movement. This was a freedom movement. They were affirming not only the values of freedom, but values of individual responsibility. At NED next month, if anybody wants an invitation, let me know. Svetlana Alexievich, all of her books, and she wrote about Chernobyl as well, interviews with people who suffered through this. It's all trying to tell, the reality of Homo Sovieticus. It's what resulted from communism. This mentality which was made possible what David is talking about, a mentality that doesn't have any moral foundation, that is morally degraded. And how do you overcome that? They were overcoming that in the Euromaidan. It was a freedom movement. They succeeded in getting rid of Yanukovych. As a result of that, Putin invaded and annexed Crimea. But what did the West do? I mean, even today, if you read the Atlantic interview on the Obama doctrine, Ukraine is accepted by the administration as part of the Russian sphere of influence, and therefore we're not going to really do anything. And if you want to, I think that if you want your equivalent of the Magnitsky Act, it would be a coherent policy for Ukraine, because if there is any way to ultimately have freedom and democracy in Russia, it is for Ukraine to become a successful, independent, democratic country. If it does, Putinism is dead. By Putinism, I mean a particular ideology of Russian imperialism. It is dead. And what you can get at that point is a normal Russian nationalism, which is worried about the problems of Russia. And that is the only way it's going to come about is first that Ukraine has to succeed. And we as a country are at a moment of immense confusion today, immense confusion, where nobody seems to even get this and nobody seems to have any feeling of solidarity with the people who were in the Maidan in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. And we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions, and I think we have to begin, still, it's not too late, to address this issue.
I just want to add just briefly, just one other comment, because I was back in Prague in 13, all 13, part of 14, back at Radio for Europe. What I know from that, and what I know from my colleagues there and in the transition zone or the transformational zone, is there's an immense amount of Russian money, Russian influence, Russian conniving, and so forth going on in all those countries to weaken liberal democracy, to weaken the multi-party parliamentary system and debase it. You can see it most egregiously in places like Hungary. But it's not only confined to Hungary, it's happening all across that region. And that is part of what this sort of astonishing propaganda output is coming out directed and coherent in its own way from Moscow.
The gentleman in the back standing up, please. Oh, you've got...
Thank you. Bart Marcois, Richard Richards Institute. And this is exactly what I wanted to ask about, is what's happening in Prague and the other V4 countries, building on Carmine's question. We see it happening all over Eastern Europe, this erosion and this undermining. It's like watching old Soviet active measures, and now they call it hybrid warfare.
Yes.
Do you know anybody who's working on that, who's writing about it, who's researching it? It's very real, and you're seeing little mini Putins springing up in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, and elsewhere. Thank you.
I can just tell you that Radio Free Europe is tracking it, and there are if you look on the website rferl.org, you'll see some parts of this. But internally, I think there's a lot of reporting going on in these countries. But Radio Free Europe doesn't do those languages anymore. We're not in We're not in the transformational zone anymore, almost completely, except in the Balkans.
Well, there are a lot of people who are following it. I mean, Ann Applebaum has written a number of articles about it in the Washington Post, and recently a piece on the Russian information offensive, which she did with Edward Lucas. Both of them are associated with an organization called the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, which has done a lot of work on this. Our International Republican Institute, which is part of the NED family, has a beacon project, which is bringing people together to focus on exactly the problem that you're talking about. There's a European Endowment for Democracy, which is working on this issue very, very actively. There are a lot of people working on this, but I think the challenge is going to be to bring them together more closely and to establish a much stronger coalition to push back against the Russians. But you're right. Some very dangerous and troubling developments are taking place, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland today.
And the issue is that a lot of these groups are being funded by Putin. Putin's very aggressively involved in the whole immigration, the migration crisis into Europe. This hybrid warfare is something in Europe that we're seeing every day, and it's astounding the impact he's had also in France with Le Pen. I mean, he's actually outwardly funding this as a point of leverage.
Gary Kasparov calls it the weaponization of refugees.
Yeah.
We have another question in the second row here, please.
Maria Jutrzewska, the Institute of World Politics. I wanted to ask a question regarding the nuclear aspect of this conflict. Namely, the moment the USSR collapsed, the Ukraine had nuclear weapons. It disarmed itself in exchange for the guarantee of security from NATO. The moment it was attacked and the Crimea was taken away from it, there was no radical response from the West. What do you think is the message that the Western powers are sending to all the countries that are somehow endangered and see the security guarantee in possessing the nuclear weapons? Are they going to be willing to disarm themselves if there is no security guarantee for them?
I'll say something very brief. Of course, it undermines any Western guarantee. And similarly, it's not the only situation of if we're looking just at the nuclear aspect, it's also significant that Libya gave up weapons of mass destruction before Gaddafi was overthrown. And the real issue, I think, in terms of Russia and Ukraine, I don't think that this was a situation in which even if Ukraine had had nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapons would have played a very, they're not designed to operate in that context very well. The important thing is to make it possible for the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and for that they need modern weapons. They're perfectly capable of fighting, and particularly in eastern Ukraine, the persons who've been recruited are oftentimes the dregs of society, and they're super armed right now. But Ukraine can do well against them with the proper defensive weapons.
No, my point is only that they were promised help if there is a conflict, and now there is a conflict and there is no help, even though they gave what they had the most powerful. So
yeah, of course. I mean, it undermines any future guarantee.
It's disgraceful, and North Korea watched it very carefully, I can assure you.
Yeah.
Nina Dubinsky, the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Charles, thank you for this wonderful discussion, and we probably need to thank the Kremlin for expelling David, because we have him in one piece here. So anyways, my question refers to the time described, as David said in his book, basically saying that Yeltsin's time was not that good at all, and it was naivete and euphoric, maybe, attitude of the US government towards Yeltsin's administration, which coincided actually with deconstruction of the United States Information Agency, which was in charge of all information going out to the former Soviet bloc at that time. Do you think it is time to revive the United States Information Agency? Thank you.
I have an institutional interest in that. As a former deputy director for international broadcasting in the last sequence of USIA, before it was abolished and consolidated into the State Department under the public diplomacy under Secretariat, I thought USIA did extraordinary work. When the Balkans crisis erupted, the people who knew the most about what was going on there were the USIA officers from that region and the diplomatic staffs. And that doesn't mean the same isn't true today, but it was just extraordinary how much they knew at that time. And I would say that the dissolution of a separate agency, along with ACTA, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and so forth, which was an adamant. It was a trade-off with Jesse Helms sitting on those demands and sitting on a major release of funds that the U.S. owed to the United Nations. That's what the trade-off was, and it didn't happen until the money was not released until that trade-off occurred, and USIA was eliminated for that reason in the same way ACTA was. I don't know whether people think that's good, bad, or indifferent. I could just say that USIA had a coherent reality. It was very important on its own, and it had enough independence and separation from the diplomatic corps that it could pursue its own issues in a way that was effective and supportive of the diplomatic sequence. So I don't say that doesn't happen now. It's just it's different, is what I would say.
In the center, back there, please.
Jackie Mahler, NDI. You mentioned that the apartment bombings were used as rhetoric to start the Second Chechen War. Would you also say that the Moscow theater siege was used as rhetoric to continue that fighting? And if that's not the reason why you think that happened and why it was staged, why do they keep putting the Chechens at the front of all these?
There was at the time of the Moscow theater siege, there was first of all, Russian public opinion had shifted against, after 3 years of fighting, had shifted against the war in Chechnya, the Second Chechen War. And there was strong support in Russia, at least according to public opinion polls, for bringing the war to a negotiated end. At the same time, there were major international efforts, some of them connected with Zbigniew Brzezinski, to find, and the Committee for Peace in Chechnya, to bring a negotiated end to the conflict. It was also at a time when Russia was engaging in massive security sweeps in Chechnya that led ultimately to thousands of people just being disappeared. In the aftermath of the Nordost theater siege and the deaths of hundreds of hostages as a result of the gas, including Americans, all talk of a negotiated settlement came to an end. And actually the same thing happened in the case of Beslan, because attempting for renewed hostilities. The Russians at the same time were anxious to install the father of Ramzan Kadyrov as a Russian puppet in Chechnya, and each side was anxious to finish off. On the one hand, the Russians were anxious to finish off the resistance. On the other hand, the resistance was anxious to show that it still survived and had the ability to do something. And the result was a terrorist attack which gave every sign of having been orchestrated by the Russian authorities themselves. However, that's a complicated situation because that the Russians had in mind was not against the school, but rather against the parliament of North Ossetia. And the outcome was not to be a massacre of the hostages, but rather a massacre of the terrorists. The problem was that when things went wrong and the terrorists changed the venue of their attack, the Russian authorities had no compunction about slaughtering the hostages, even though they were parents and children. And they behaved in a manner in which no civilized. We can compare them with what happened in 1974 in Malat in Israel, in which the Israeli authorities were ready to release, where Palestinians terrorists seized a school. And the Israeli authorities agreed to release the most horrific terrorists that they had in their custody in order to spare the children. Then things began. Then things went wrong for a series of reasons. But as far as we're talking now about the intentions of the two sides, the Russians were concerned to massacre the terrorists and to establish the conditions for a Chechnya under their control, and if that meant killing the hostages, they didn't care.
Just one point. This type of strategy, this false flag strategy, is something in my practice we ran across not only in Thailand, but in the CIA playbook. It was used by the CIA in the 70s in Italy, where there were a number of Red Army factions that later turned out, including possibly the murder of Moro, to have been commissioned by the Italian army. So this strategy of tension, the Russians did not invent, but unfortunately they've taken it to a whole new
Well,
level.
they actually did invent it. We're the ones who learned from them.
There's one other point I'd like to make about these peripheral wars. I think we know from the invasion of Afghanistan that Soviet misstep and tragedy. You know, there's almost nothing more sinister than denying to families when a loved one has departed, denying access to the remains. We know that from that time, many of the young conscripts who lost their lives in Afghanistan were buried in remote places with anodyne markings on their headstones. And the same thing had been happening in Chechnya. It's now happening again in the Ukrainian conflict because they do not want to have the kind of outpouring of grief publicly that it would be if these were public burials. And so this is part of a sequence of denial of reality that is quite profound and quite sinister in what it does to the moral fiber of the country. It gets so that those Russian residents whom I've talked to over the years have the view that they don't believe anybody. There's no purpose in believing anybody anymore, any source of information, because they're all lying in some way, they're all deceiving in some way, they're all guilty of crimes against my ability to believe in anything. Therefore, I don't believe in anything. I'm going to withhold belief. Not faith, and not some mystical saving, but in what's going on in my own country. I can't believe what I'm being told about it, and I don't want to believe it. In the aftermath of the shoot-down of the Russian fighter bomber over Syria, it was that enormous, astonishing pictorial sequence of the plane dying in flames, enormously powerful visual. I talked to people thereafter. They believed, first of all, that the Americans had done it. Secondly, if the Americans had not done it, that NATO did it, which is the same thing. And then there were people who didn't believe anything. They just believed that a plane had gone down, and it was probably Russian pilots who died heroically or whatever. They didn't believe anything else that had to do with it because they were just said, I can't believe in any of this stuff, period. So you get to a kind of stopping point in terms of the social and the moral cohesion of a country where people have that kind of view.
I think this brings up, if I may ask a question, then I'll get to you. David talks about morality in his book. I mean, it's not fashionable, to say the least, for political scientists to talk about morality, especially in international affairs. So what's going on here, David? Why are you talking so much about morality? What's the importance and significance of that?
I don't know. Do I talk about that? Well, it's actually a lot of political science is fact-based, and in order to understand a country with a different psychology, you have to understand really the frame of mind in which those facts are being produced. What happened? I mean, in Russia, it actually was very explicit. The communist regime tried to reinterpret morality. In 1918, I believe, or 19, Lenin made his famous speech to the Komsomol, in which he explained the principles of communist morality, which was anything that serves the purposes of the revolution is good, anything that interferes with the revolution is bad. And so therefore, it was not any sense of right and wrong that was supposed to guide people's actions, but rather whatever was in the interests of building communism. And who was building communism? Communist Party is building communism. And who's in charge of Communist Party? Well, the leadership of the Communist Party. So in other words, anything that right is whatever the leadership considers to be right. And there's no higher standard to which, against which their actions can be judged. That mentality has been preserved in Russia because it was not renounced after the fall of communism. And there was no reassertion of the moral standards that exist in the rest of the world, the system of universal morality, which is applicable not only to citizens but also to leaders. And as a result, it was perfectly, actually, there's nothing wrong with bombing, blowing up people when they sleep, because it's in the interests of the state. Or opening fire on hostages with flamethrowers, that's perfectly okay, because that's also in the interests of the state. And the present Russian leadership are not great philosophers, but to the extent that they're capable of thinking of anything, they have enunciated a kind of bastardized version of the communist ideology and the supremacy of state interests as their guiding doctrine. So what needed to happen after the fall of communism, and what didn't happen, was the reorientation of the country according to universal moral principles. In fact, the basic ideas of communism continued to hold sway. The idea that what determines the moral legal climate of the country is the nature of the economic system. All you have to do is change the economic system and everything else will change. All you have to do is put in a superior economic system. So if you put an end to socialism, create capitalism, theoretically, give property to every gangster, thief, bribe taker, and undesirable that you can find, the result is going to be a flourishing law-based democracy. Well, it doesn't happen that way. And so therefore, the core of the regime and the core of the mentality is in that inversion of morality. So you have to understand that, then you can understand everything else.
Quick comment, Bob, and then we'll go to...
because I think there's a significant point that's being made here, and what you've raised as to what is the usefulness of the discussion and the issues that David is raising. And during the Cold War, there was in the superficial way, but there was democracy and communism, and people understood that communism was totalitarianism, that it was an ideology that you had to oppose it. In the post-Cold War world, there is no understanding that there is another side with a different set of moral principles. And I think that's what David is raising, and it's very important. So people can get away with the idea of moral equivalence. And we can even get away with this, what I think has taken over in the West, a kind of postmodernism where there are no moral values whatsoever. Everything is relative. And I think he's making the point that there are moral principles. Those moral principles were violated in a fundamental way by a particular regime, and you need to know that there is something at issue here because Americans don't understand that anymore, and we have to start having that kind of a discussion, and I think David is starting that kind of a discussion.
Bob, did you want to add something?
The only thing I can say is that one of the best exemplars of this is Kadyrov's control in Chechnya. And what I compare it to is the United States deciding that we're just going to hand New York over to the five families, because in reality, that's what Putin did. He made the literal deal with the devil and handed an incredibly central part of the country from a security standpoint to a mafia. It's incredible.
Tanya Nyberg, Magnitsky Act Initiative. David, my congratulations with this book, and I know there's a lot of hard work behind it. I have a question probably. What can you say about Andrei Nekrasov? I know you had interaction with him. What happened with him, and why he made this documentary about Magnitsky case? Thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, Andrei Nekrasov and I made a documentary film together, supposedly. I was asked, first book I ever wrote, which is about the fall of the Soviet Union. And the problem was, and I even received a a foundation grant to do it. And the problem was that I was not a filmmaker. I didn't know anything about making a movie. I've watched movies. I never made one. But I met Andre, who actually, the whole thing is just star-crossed. I met him here at Hudson when I first spoke about the apartment buildings, and he made a movie about the apartment buildings, which you can still find, by the way, on the internet. It's called Disbelief. And I have a big role in that movie. And then I thought, well, he made a good movie. Maybe he can help me make this movie. And he disappeared ultimately with a large sum of the movie's money, left me with about 150 hours of videotape. I had no idea what to do. I taught myself how to make a movie because I was responsible for the money that he had stolen. And finally, I got it done. But Andre, I was interviewed about him by a Russian journal, a Russian site called Ejnedelny Journal. And I said, I'll tell you what I told him. I said that many people in Russia have some principles, but they lack the moral strength to act according to those principles. And after all these years of deprivation, material deprivation, they're suddenly given unlimited opportunities to steal. Many people simply could not resist the temptation. They were too weak morally to withstand the temptation, and Andre was ready to sell himself. I didn't realize it at the time because he had sold himself to Berezovsky, and Berezovsky was interested. For purely accidental reasons, Nekrasov and I were on the same side. But as soon as somebody else offered him money to do just the opposite, for example, slander Magnitsky, he would be ready to do that. Or if Berezovsky got into his head that it was necessary to make a movie praising Lukashenko, and he was going to pay for that, he would do that. That kind of cynicism you don't find every day, but it's surprisingly common, unfortunately, in Russia.
We have a question in the second row here, please.
Abe Shulsky from Hudson. I'm very interested in something Mr. Klose just said, which is that the result of this propaganda, he suggested, isn't so much a belief in the propaganda, but rather a disbelief in everything. And that in a way is not so bad from the regime's point of view, because if the people don't believe your propaganda, well, that's not so good. But if they don't believe anything, they can't organize themselves to oppose you in any way. I mean, it makes the population inert if it's impossible for anybody to convince them of anything. They can't be organized. So I guess that raises the question, what do you foresee as the future of all this in Russia now? Because, I mean, Putin had some real advantages when he came in. When he first came in, the price of oil was starting to rise, and it rose for 7-8 years, produced a lot of money. And secondly, the disorder of the 90s, at least as we understand it, or as I understand, was so great that even a modicum of order in the country seemed like a big advantage, so that he could get a certain popularity out of just having stabilized things in a certain way. But as those advantages disappear, I mean, the money disappears, the memory of the 90s obviously grows weaker with time. What do you foresee as the result of all this?
I'll just give a brief answer, but David, I think, would have more profound things to say. What I can see, first of all, is that, as we already know, the best and the brightest are transportable in this global economy, and a lot have left. That's for sure. And I think people, they're waiting for something to happen, in effect, because nothing is happening in the way they would like it to happen. And I think that that sequence is in place and it's continuing and it's deepening. And it makes the possibility of getting to a rational outcome makes it almost harder to have happen. I can't predict anything. That's not my business. What I do know is that the disaffection and the separation and the demoralization, in effect, that life can get better. We're seeing some of that in our own country. People have given up the notion that they can have a better life for themselves and their children. When that starts to hit, you get to very difficult places, and the responsibility of the leaderships at whatever level has to be to pay attention to that and make things better, so people's notion that things can be better can in fact have substance and not just slogan.
Well, it seems to me it's all of you want to answer this question, but I think that would be appropriate.
I'll just say that in my experience, many Russians actually have their doubts about the official propaganda, and they understand at some level that they're being manipulated, even if they go along with the manipulation. But they tell themselves that actually the situation isn't any different anywhere else. It's that our government manipulates the truth. Well, their government does the same, and actually what we're doing is closer to what's right than what's done elsewhere. I knew someone, for example, who was absolute supporter of the Putin regime on one hand, and then on the other hand would turn around and say that she knew or she had heard about people who were working as Putin's assassins, carrying out assassinations. She didn't see any particular conflict between Putin being a great guy and the fact that he was also organizing the killings of people. If you were to ask her, she would probably say, "Well, isn't that the way it works?" So that kind of the brainwashing is sufficient, but it's also vulnerable. That means that with the right kind of counter-information, a lot could change in Russia.
You have to remember that the target of that propaganda is not just the Russian people, it's the West. And this is very systematic. Peter Pomerantsev has written about this, calls it the weaponization of information. And what they're doing is a very conscious policy. This is the Russian information policy today, which is different from during the Cold War, where they would promote a propaganda line. Now it is to undermine the very notion of truth. And that is having an effect. And that is why we can't get a consensus on what to do, why there is no foundation for thinking of what is true, what is not true. Well, nothing is true. And there is a constituency for that view here and in Europe. And it's very, very dangerous. And we have to think about a way, we have to analyze the Russian information policy. I mean, if we had a USIA, it could do that. But others need to do that now. We have to know what it is, where it's going, what its impact is, and how to counter it.
And I think the emphasis on public diplomacy doesn't do it yet. We need to be a lot more scientific, and we also have to address in our own society the silo effect. And you know, I live a good chunk of my time in Europe, and people in Europe laugh at the United States in terms of the way the media in this country reports politics. Fox and Friends on one side and MSNBC on the other. I mean, if you read Le Monde or The Times, you laugh at American political reportage. And many are starting to tune into RT and saying, you know what, that's more coherent than Fox and Friends in terms of dealing with European issues. What's frightening is that people like me and others get invited on to RT now. They're really getting out in a very big way, and people, I'll tell you, people in the UK, for instance, are treating it as just any other normal channel. And when you challenge them, they throw Fox in your face. And they say, You know, it's a free country. Everybody's allowed their views. And look, you know, the American position, the hard right position on news is no different than Russia's. And those are arguments that have to be addressed. And we can't just make a lot of assumptions about that.
David, do we have the last word from you?
Okay, we can. I would just thank everyone for coming and hope that, in fact, you will take a look at the book and that its arguments about Russian history will somehow leave us better informed than we've been in the past. But anyway, thank you very much.